Hello and welcome to the second installment in this pretty rarely produced series on this channel. I don't put out videos in this series that often. In fact, this is only the second episode ever, although I do definitely have more planned. And in this series, we basically take certain moments from certain films. It could be in multiple genre types, and many of my favourite moments are, but they're those moments which, at least for me personally, stood out the most. And I don't mean in a general sense, because there are plenty of movies which I love and plenty of moments in those movies which are iconic, but these moments are the ones which, for whatever reason for me personally, really stood out. It could have been some storytelling device which really impressed me with its simplicity, or it could be a really effectively chilling or creepy moment, such as from The Babadook or The Thing, or movies like that. Now this one kind of touches on more of that horror element. In the first installment of this series, which is actually a more successful video so far than I expected it to be, I discussed my favourite moment from the Andromeda Strain movie, which is actually the ending of the film. And that leads us on to this one because, of course, when you're talking about stuff like the ending of a movie or a pivotal moment, you are by definition going to have spoilers. So, of course, spoiler alert. However, in this particular pick, we're going slightly different to the Andromeda ending, because the thing that I loved about that was the meaning behind it. Whereas this movie moment is one which I like in a more on-the-nose kind of way. No pun intended, and you'll see why I say that in just a second. This movie is one which is quite topical currently, because of course we recently had the newer version of Stephen King's It, the first part of it at least, released in cinemas. I absolutely loved it, I reviewed the movie, etc, etc, but there is another movie in that very similar vein of child-eating monster clowns which doesn't get the same level of respect or acclaim or even chatter among communities and fandoms that something like It does. Now that isn't surprising, because It is such a well-known property. It's in the pop culture top 10 icons probably of Pennywise as a character. The book itself, entirely separate from the films, is popular. Whereas this one doesn't have all of that behind it. This one is just a good movie in its own way, and the movie in question is simply called Clown. The movie is often called Eli Roth's Clown. That's not the title, but that's often how people refer to it, even though Eli Roth actually didn't direct the movie. He just presents it in a similar way to how Tarantino sometimes does. Now, this movie had a staggered release. It was initially released, I think, in 2014 or 2015, and then it was released later on in other places, so some people consider it to be a lot newer than it actually is. It was just where it happened to be released. But the essential concept of this movie, simply called Clown, is very similar actually to Pennywise. And as I said, we will be discussing spoilers, so I'll very quickly give you a rundown of what the concept of the movie is. It's essentially about a father who wants to have a birthday clown for his son. The clown doesn't show up for whatever reason, that's kind of irrelevant, and so he tries to find a costume where he can provide the entertainment at the party as a clown for his son instead. He's looking at old mop heads to wear on his head and raggy clothes, but then he discovers in one of the houses that he's renovating an old chest chained to the wall. He manages to get it open and find a clown costume, because in this house are a number of old costumes, like clown costumes and various other types from different ages. A collection, if you will, very much so. But when he finds this particular clown costume, which funnily enough looks an awful lot like the new Pennywise, even though it came out before the new Pennywise did, very interesting there, it's also, just like Pennywise, a very old-fashioned clown design. It has that kind of mottled, white, old leather look to it, rather than cloth. And it has the frilly sleeves and the frilly neck, again like Pennywise. Of course that is a stereotypical clown thing, but it is interesting just how similar the costume looks in its essential ingredients, not necessarily design. But he puts this costume on, puts on a nose and a wig, and then performs at the party. It all goes well, he falls asleep with the costume still on, and then the next morning he's got to go to work. But he finds that he cannot take the costume off. It's tight around his neck, he can't get the red nose off, he can't take the wig off. It's almost as if it's rooted to him. And that basically moves on from there. Now, so far that may not seem to be similar to Pennywise, but what many people may not know, people who aren't familiar with the book, for instance, of it, is that Pennywise initially was a human, and then it became possessed, in effect, at a certain point, and became the Pennywise that we know. In a similar way, this is kind of a similar story, if you will. It's just a normal guy who, in this case, happened to put on a clown costume that he shouldn't have. And now that he's put it on, he can't get it off, and it's almost as if it's starting to become him, or to control him, and gives him this insatiable hunger. But at this point he doesn't know what this hunger is for. He starts raiding the fridge, as it were, and eating everything in the kitchen. But it's still not enough. He's still having these crazy loud stomach rumblings. And throughout the film he starts getting stronger urges, and they start to become more directly towards a certain group, and that is children, in a similar way to Pennywise. Again, the similarities are very, very close in some ways. And what you find out through the film is that this costume is what they refer to as a demon in the film. That seems to be a very loose definition. It's more like a monster of folklore rather than a traditional demon, but whatever, you can call it what you want, I guess. But it's a creature referred to initially as the Cloyne, which is a great character. It's much more primal and more animalistic than Pennywise. It doesn't really bother with humour at all, whereas Pennywise of course does. Pennywise likes to play with his prey and make them scared so that they taste better, whereas the Cloyne doesn't really have time for that. He just wants to eat a certain amount of children so he can hibernate again. Again, an awful lot similar to Pennywise. Now, my favourite moment in this movie, and I have plenty of moments which I love, is actually a moment which I think many people probably wouldn't love as much as I do, but that's often the case with my favourite moments, and this particular moment is, again, spoiler alert, but of course if you've got this far you should know that. He goes to one of his buildings which he's renovating, which he believes he'll be left alone in, because he doesn't want to eat these kids, but he still gets presented opportunities to do so, and is finding it more difficult to resist it. So he goes to one of these places. It's kind of a dive, a number of small houses with a little dirt yard in front of them. And he goes into this place, essentially an empty building, and there's this kid that won't leave him alone. He wants the kid to leave him alone, of course, but the kid is just too friendly, because he's a clown. The kid's not afraid of the clown, he wants to go up and talk to him. The kid can understand that the guy wants to be alone. Now he decides to kill himself. The clown, that is, not the kid. So he gets a gun, puts it in his mouth, and shoots himself. And it's effectively done. Now this isn't my favourite moment, but it is very effectively done. You see coloured blood, like a rainbow, splatter on the wall behind him, and he slumps into the bath. But then a few seconds later he coughs and wakes up again, because this costume, in effect, will not allow him to die. It will not allow him to kill himself. Kind of like a Hulk thing going on there. So he decides that what he needs to do is to go down the route of the traditional way of killing this creature, which is to remove its head, because that's what you have to do to ultimately remove the curse, if you will, of the costume from whatever poor soul happens to be wearing it at the time. So he goes to the DIY store and picks up a couple of circular saws, sets them up in his room in this little building, and basically sets it up in such a way so that he can lean back on a chair, lose his balance, fall, and then hopefully have his head severed by these two circular saws. Sounds like a good plan. Obviously it takes a lot of courage to try and do that, and this is where my favourite moment in the whole film comes in. And those of you who have seen the movie, chances are if you clicked on this video you probably already have seen it, you know exactly what I'm going to say now. And it tells you a lot about the kind of stuff that I like, because this moment, it's pretty powerful, I think. In a movie which could very easily be like a generic B movie with really bad quality, it really isn't. It's a really good horror film, and one which is very undervalued. But this moment is simultaneously comedic, gory, and tragic, all at the same time. But you have to think about it to appreciate that. It's a moment which passes fairly quickly, but I just really appreciate it. And what happens is he starts at the circular saws, he leans back on the chair, he begins to lose his balance, and just as his legs leave the ground to roll back, in effect, into the saws, the kid opens the door and grabs his attention, making him fall incorrectly, hitting the circular saw, which makes the saw hit the blade of the other saw, which then shatters the metal of the circular saw and sending a piece of the blade across the room. And although you don't see it on camera, as it pans across, you see that this blade has gone through the child's torso. The child drops to the ground with blood, etc., and dies. Now that moment does a number of things really well. One thing is it kills a kid. You don't kill kids and you don't kill dogs, everyone knows that, but if you do it well. It's like The Thing. Don't show the audience the monster, but if you're going to show it, blow their mind, and that is what The Thing does. Likewise with this movie, you don't kill kids in movies, but if you're going to kill them, make it graphic, and that is what this movie does, because although you don't see the moment of death, you see the aftermath pretty well. And I love that moment for so many different reasons. It's got this dark, comedic essence to it, where it's not done for a laugh, but I still found it funny in a weird kind of way, probably because I have a black heart, but also it's of course tragic, because of all the moments in the film where he kills a child or hurts a child, this is that one moment that he wasn't trying to. And it's one of the most brutal deaths, because he's actually trying to do the exact opposite to what happens. He's trying to stop himself from hurting anyone else by killing himself. But in so doing, he kills a kid. It's got such a wonderful, simple tragedy to it, while, as I said, simultaneously being, at least for me, very darkly comedic. It definitely gets a chuckle out of me every time, and at the same time offers the kind of gore, especially on-screen gore, the aftermath in particular, which you want from a film like this. It's a killer clown who eats kids. You want that kind of gore. And there's plenty of, not necessarily taboo gore, but plenty of moments in the film which are like, okay, that's pretty intense. But this one, for me, takes the cake. It's the kind of scene from a movie where I would view that scene, that entire moment from when he sets up the trap to it going wrong, in effect, and killing the kid. If that scene, which doesn't run for very long, it's a couple of minutes basically, if you could condense that down into just that moment instead of the entire film, then to me that would be the kind of moment that you would show as the proof of product for this movie. If you were trying to pitch this film and get funding for it, I think that's the scene that you would show, because it shows everything about the movie in such a beautifully simple way. It shows, hey, we've got this movie, it's colourful, but it's dark at the same time, it's black comedy, but at the same time gory and tragic. It just wraps up every essence of the film into a 2 or 3 minute scene. And that to me is fantastic. Now when you watch it in the film, I've of course hyped it up a lot, so if you haven't seen it yet, you've been spoiled for one thing, but when you go and see it, you'll probably think, wow, he's really overhyping this moment. It passes in a few seconds really, and okay, it didn't seem that impressive to me, but that's the thing. A lot of my favourite moments are moments which aren't necessarily pizzazz or have the shock value in the moment, although this one does to some degree. They tend to be the movie moments, and also games as well, where you have to actually think about the implication of the moment to appreciate, I would say, the beautiful simplicity of what they did with that scene. Not just the way it's shot or any obvious technical stuff like that, but the thought behind it, the writing, the reason, in effect, for the scene, what it represents. I like that, and I really like that in this film. So, it was kind of a long video, but so was the one for Andromeda. So as always, I would appreciate your thoughts down below. If you have seen the movie, I'd love to hear if you enjoyed it. I know a lot of people do. It's got kind of a cult following in a similar way to some of my other favourite horror films like Harbinger Down or Split. And currently, it's certainly topical, considering how similar to Pennywise it is. But that's it overall for this particular pick of my favourite movie moments, and who knows when the next one's going to be. These videos are so far apart. But regardless, as always, thanks for watching.